In February 2025, one of the largest ancient DNA studies ever published landed in the middle of a 200-year-old argument. A team led by David Reich at Harvard pulled genetic material from 435 ancient skeletons scattered across Eurasia and used it to trace the origin of the Yamnaya, the steppe herders that most geneticists already believed had carried Indo-European languages across Europe and Asia. But the headline was not the Yamnaya. It was who came before them. Here is the plain version of what these scientists do. When a person dies and is buried, traces of their DNA can survive in their bones and teeth for thousands of years. Extract enough of it from enough individuals, and you can compare their ancestry the way you would compare cousins in a family, seeing who descends from whom, which groups mixed, and roughly when. Line those genetic relationships up against the dates of the graves and the archaeology of the sites, and you can start to reconstruct the movements of whole populations that left no written records at all. The 200-year-old argument is about language. Back in the late 1700s, scholars noticed that Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and most European languages share deep, systematic similarities, as if they had all descended from one lost mother tongue. That family is now called Indo-European, and today, more than 4 in 10 people on Earth speak one of its languages. But nobody could agree on where the original speakers lived, or when they started to spread. By around 2015, Ancient DNA had delivered a strong answer to part of that puzzle. Studies showed a huge pulse of ancestry sweeping into Europe from the eastern steppe about 5,000 years ago, and it lined up with the Yamnaya, mobile herders from the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, buried under mounds called kurgans, moving with wagons and domesticated horses. The Yamnaya looked like the engine that spread Indo-European languages west into Europe and east toward India. But that answer left a hole. If the Yamnaya spread these languages, where did the Yamnaya themselves come from? And there was a stubborn complication in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The oldest recorded Indo-European languages, including Hittite, were spoken there. Yet when researchers looked at the DNA of those Bronze Age Anatolians, they did not carry the Yamnaya ancestry you would expect if the Yamnaya had brought their language. The family's earliest known branch did not fit the simple version of the story. That is the gap the 2025 work set out to close. To close it, the team did not just sample the Yamnaya. They sampled the populations living around and before them, across the steppe and the Caucasus, over thousands of years. And when they modeled how all that ancestry fit together, a single earlier population kept surfacing as the source. They call it the Caucasus Lower Volga people, a group that lived in the dry steppe between the northern foothills of the Caucasus Mountains and the lower Volga River, roughly between 4,500 and 3,500 BCE. This is the finding that earned the word rewrote. About 4/5 of Yamnaya ancestry traces back to these Caucasus Lower Volga people. In other words, the group everyone had been pointing to as the origin was itself mostly descended from a smaller, older population that had gone almost unnoticed. The steppe migration story from 2015 was not wrong. It was missing the deeper layer. The beginning sat in a cluster of people you could have fit into a small modern town. The second 2025 paper shows how that source population turned into the Yamnaya. Focused on the North Pontic region, today's Ukraine and Moldova, it added 81 more ancient genomes from the ground where the transformation happened. As Caucasus Lower Volga people moved west, they mixed with local foragers along the Dnipro and Don rivers, forming a group archaeologists call Serednii Stih. Out of that mixture, around 4,000 BCE, the Yamnaya took shape. Within a few centuries, they expanded across the steppe. Now the payoff, the Anatolian problem. Remember, the Hittites did not carry Yamnaya ancestry, so they could not simply descend from the later Yamnaya expansion. But the same Caucasus Lower Volga source that built the Yamnaya also shows up in a smaller amount in those Bronze Age Anatolians. That gives the two branches a shared parent without forcing one to come from the other. The Yamnaya and the Anatolians look less like grandparent and grandchild and more like cousins tracing back to the same step-grandparents. That lets the researchers make their boldest proposal. If one population is the common source of both the Anatolian branch and everything else, then the last shared stage of the ancestral language, what they call Proto-Indo-Anatolian, was most likely spoken by these Caucasus Lower Volga people, sometime between about 4400 and 4000 BCE. It is the closest anyone has come to pointing at a specific place, a specific time, and a specific community and saying, the deep ancestor of these languages was probably here. It is worth being honest about what DNA can and cannot do here. Genomes record ancestry, not speech. No one dug up a recording of Proto-Indo-Anatolian. What the DNA does is narrow the field. It shows which populations were in the right place at the right time, moving in the right directions to have carried these languages. The claim gets its force because three kinds of evidence point toward the same reconstruction: genetics, archaeology, and linguistics. When independent lines converge, the story becomes much harder to dismiss. And that is the larger point of the Reich Lab's approach. A single genome tells you about one person. Hundreds of ancient genomes, stitched together with dates and dig sites, become something closer to a time machine for populations, a way to watch people mix, move, and replace one another across thousands of years in places that never wrote anything down. The origin of the Indo-Europeans is one case study. The same method is quietly redrawing the deep history of our species, one buried genome at a time.